Our Old Testament text today comes from the book of 1 Kings. And it's chapter 19, verses 19 through 21. It's on the screen, so if you like, you can read with me. So he set out from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat, who was plowing. There were 12 yoke of oxen ahead of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by Elisha and threw his mantle over him. Elisha left the oxen and ran after Elijah. And he said, "Let me kiss my dad and my mom, and then I will follow you." He returned from following him. He took the yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. And then, using the equipment from the oxen, he boiled their flesh and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he, Elisha, set out and followed Elijah and became his servant. That is the word of the Lord. Our New Testament text is from Mark chapter 9, and we start with verse 2. And we read through verse 9, and I would like for you to read this with me, all right? 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. That is the word of the Lord. As boys, my brother and I, and he was only 18 months younger than I was, so you can imagine my mother had her hands full. But we would play until we would lose our inhibitions. Adrenaline would take over, and we'd begin to push the boundaries and cross those proverbial lines that Mom had set for us. Our excitement was elevated. The noise we made would get louder. Things around us became part of collateral damage. And in the midst of our chaos, my mother would speak to us. But in all honesty, we saw her mouth moving, but we didn't hear her. It was much like the teacher on the Peanuts cartoon. Wah, 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 wah. A second time, Mom would speak to me and John, and again, wah, 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 wah. Then, without seeming to walk across the room, my mother suddenly appeared before us. There she was, standing in front of us, bending down. Her right hand would take my brother's cheek and turn his face toward hers. Her left hand would take my cheek and turn my face toward hers. And right there in that split second, she had our undivided attention, holding our hands, directing our attention to her. Then in clear and non-angry tones, she said to us, "Listen to me." And with that, the chaotic movements of 2 excited adolescent boys became calm. With the utterance of those 3 words, we understood that what she meant was stop the horseplay, stop pushing the boundaries, stop breaking the rules, get some peripheral vision, pay attention, be reminded of what you've been told and taught, and start acting like who you know that you are. Listen to me. She was saying to us, I know what's best for you. I have your best interest at heart. I know you better than you know yourself. Let me remind you who you are. Although the book of Mark does not appear chronologically first in our Testament canon, it is, according to historians and scholars, the first gospel written after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But first or not, Mark is surely the only New Testament which calls itself a gospel. The first verse of the chapter says, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The purpose of Mark's gospel is to bear witness to Jesus Christ as proclaimer and embodiment of the kingdom of God, and to challenge his readers to follow Christ. Mark's gospel was written to a very early group of Christians. Some of them were still struggling with their Judaism, which they'd converted from, but they were still holding on. Some were Gentile Christians who'd moved over into this place, and there were these Jewish people. There was a lot of disjointedness. So the Jewish people considered them outcasts. The Gentiles thought they weren't truly following because they had not given everything. And the Roman people thought they were crazy. But these Christians wanted to know one thing, and I believe that it is the one thing that this culture, this society, and this world is asking us today. And the question is it true? I've been haunted for several weeks now. Terry played me a video on Facebook a few weeks ago, and there's this young woman in her mid-20s. And she's bemoaning the role of the church in this society. It's not an indictment. More so, it's a plea for the church to please give her something that's relevant. She says, I'm tired of feel-good sermons that don't give me anything that matter on Tuesday when I'm at work. So I can tell you today that I've been haunted by that. If we just come here out of some perfunctory notion, if we just come because we think we have to, then we are wasting our time. The world is asking the question, is it true? In essence, those early readers were saying, if we're going to commit ourselves to this teaching, if we're going to share the good news of this gospel, if we're going to risk relationships, if we're going to risk our socioeconomic status, if we're going to risk our very lives and religious heritage, then we have to know, is this true? Mark's gospel is an attempt to answer that question. Mark is not concerned with stars or angels or choirs or mangers or virgins or carpenters or the magi or shepherds or even Jesus' lineage. Rather, Mark is going to anchor his gospel in one affirmation, and that is that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. The first event we witness in Mark is the baptism of Jesus. Mark goes straight for it. And when Jesus comes out of the water, it says the heavens are opened and that a voice comes down and says, this is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. This is my beloved. That's the first. The end of the gospel will be the resurrection. And there the women will go into the tomb. And the angel will say, what are you doing here? Why are you seeking the living among the dead? Because Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, is not here. So you see, Mark has a reason to anchor in this affirmation. So here we are standing in the middle of Mark at the beginning of Lent. And we have this crazy story. What are we to make of it? And I know John did a brilliant job last week of talking about the dazzling white. And you know, when I think about it, I love a God who can levitate. I love a God who can talk with dead people. I love a God who can show us apparitions and apparitions. I love that. And that's what this story really is when you think about it. And he took Peter, James, and John up there. What are we to make of it? We follow them up this mountain. When they arrive, Jesus is transfigured. Whatever that means. It's the only time in the Bible that word's used. Then Moses and Elijah, dead people show up. How did they know it was Moses and Elijah? There was no Facebook photo page for them to say, oh, I know them. But Mark says they realized who they were. And they engage in conversation with Jesus. What would they have been talking about? What might they have said? The Greek word is metamorpho, and I love that word, metamorpho. Would you say that? Metamorpho. It gives us our English word metamorphosis. Now, Mark doesn't elaborate on the word, but we realize that it has something to do with some sort of change. In a lot of places in the Bible, it's translated transformed or changed. But here in Mark's gospel, it is solidly translated by scholar after scholar as transfigured. So here we are, 2015, in the middle of Mark, at the beginning of Lent, and we're left to wonder, what does it mean? But more importantly, what does it have to do with us today? I tell you what it did for the disciples. It scared them to death. Mark's account tells us that they were terrified. The Greek word really means out of one's wits. They were freaked out. Peter's the only one to respond, and Peter's response is to build something. Now, I think that's a perfectly human and natural response. Let's enshrine it. Let's memorialize it. You see, that's what always happens to saints and prophets who are dangerous. We bronze them. We drain them of their passion in life. We trap them in stained glass windows. We make icons out of them. We confine them safely in memories of the past. I mean, even in my garden, there's a cement statue of St. Francis. Malcolm X is on a postage stamp. Martin Luther King gets one day a year, and Jesus gets commercialized till we don't even recognize him anymore, and there's all these golden crucifixes and lights. That's what we do. And that's what Peter wanted to do. It's perfectly human. But to Peter's response, there is no response. No one there, not James, not John, not Jesus, not Moses, not Elijah, says anything. Rather, this event gets even more magnanimous and mysterious when a cloud overshadows them, and from the cloud a voice speaks. Now, I don't know what kind of voice it was. I don't know if it was the movie trailer Don LaFontaine kind of big booming voice. I don't know if it was the voice of a child. I don't know if it was a female voice or a male voice. Mark doesn't tell us any insight about the tone, the timbre, the inflection, the dynamics, or the quality. What he wants to say is there's some words that you need to hear. This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him. You see, I have realized this week that the gospel of the good news is a disruptive affirmation about the truth of who you are. And here in the midst of this mystery, here in the midst of this terrifying event, there is a disruption of an affirmation. I think this transfiguration event is much like the mommy intervention event I shared with you up front. This event was terrifying, but not nearly as terrifying as what was happening day by day in the lives of these disciples. The kingdom of heaven was exploding before them, and they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to explain it. They didn't know how to respond to it. I think we in culture are terrified. I watch the news and I'm terrified. I listen to NPR on the way to work and I'm nauseated at what's going on in the world. And I want to know, I need a disruptive affirmation. I am freaked out. You see, the disciples had a very preconceived expectation of what the Messiah meant and what the Messiah would do. They believed the Messiah was the anointed one. They believed the Messiah would come. They believed the Messiah would lead a rebellion. They believed the Messiah would overthrow the Roman government, release the oppressed. They believed they were going to rule and reign with the Messiah. They thought they were finally going to relinquish that low socioeconomic status. They thought they were going to move up the ladder and become some sort of princes of the new regime. But that is a very human way of thinking. But into that human way of thinking, into that pushing of the boundaries, into that chaotic moment in time, into that situation where the excitement level is growing and the adrenaline is beginning to rush, God takes his hand, so to speak, and he cups you by the cheek and he turns your face toward his face, and he says, listen to my words. In that moment, God is saying, I know what's best for you. I know you better than you know yourself. I have your best interest at heart. Let me remind you of who you are. This week, I got a message from a friend of mine who has a friend whose brother is in the hospital and is dying. This man has been in the hospital for 5 weeks. He's suffered all types of bodily harm. And he has lived a very rough life. Obvious when you see him. But when I stepped into the room, they said to him, "This is Pastor Ken." And I got to tell you, that challenges me, that title. Because suddenly there's all expectations of what you can and can't do. But when they said, "This is Pastor Ken," this man reached his hand out to me from the bed, and I went over and I took this 50-year-old by the hand. And he said to me, "We got a lot of work to do to get me good enough for God to love me." Into that chaotic space, into those 20-some tubes running to him, into that trauma ICU, into that multitude of nurses that are stomping around his bed, comes the disruptive affirmation, "You are my son, you are the beloved." You see, the gospel of the good news, it is a disruptive affirmation into this chaotic world. All through the Gospels, Christ tells his disciples, "If you have eyes to see and ears to hear." But we're left here to wonder exactly what it is Christ wants us to hear. When we read the New Testament text, what were the first 3 words? Anybody? 6 days later. So if a text starts with something that says 6 days later, it's important for us to see what happened 6 days before. So we have to go and look. In the preceding 2 chapters, Jesus had walked on water. He had healed the demonic man. He had healed the Syrophoenician's daughter. He had cured a deaf man. He had fed 4,000 people with just a few pieces of fish and bread. He had cured another blind man. And then Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And in the midst of that, the disciples responded, "Some say you're Moses. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist." And then Jesus takes the question and makes it poignant and personal. And he says, "But who do you say that I am?" There's a lot of things out there in this world telling people who Jesus is. But the woman at the grocery store wants to know who you say that Jesus is. The nurse at the doctor's office wants to know who you think Jesus is. The teacher that teaches your child wants to know who you think Jesus is. Your boss wants to know who you believe that Jesus is. Peter speaks up again. And in that acclamation, he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Messiah." There's Peter once again, robust fisherman, saying what he thinks. And in that moment of acclamation, in that affirmation, Jesus begins to deliver to them the secret way of the kingdom. So here he is telling them what it is they need to hear. Some say it's the secret message of Jesus. Jesus shares with them in no uncertain terms that he must suffer, he must be rejected, he must be betrayed, he must be killed, and he will be resurrected. And they too are to follow. At the hearing of that unexpected and unacceptable proclamation, Peter pulls Jesus aside. Now just think about it. Peter had just said, "Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." But here in the next verse, Peter rebukes Jesus. How dare he rebuke Christ, the Son of the living God? You see, Peter was thinking in human terms, and Jesus was trying to get them to see in divine terms. And here's the challenge. Peter signed up for rebellion, not servanthood. He signed up to rule, not to wash dirty feet. He signed up to oversee logistics, not to feed homeless and hungry people. He didn't want to clothe the naked and tend to the orphans. He signed up for heroism and magnificent of a glorious rebellion. But Jesus juxtaposes the human way with the divine way and says, "Satan, get behind me, because you're focused on the wrong things. You need to be thinking on divine things." Sometimes I believe I'm Peter. Brian McLaren writes, listen carefully, "What if Jesus of Nazareth was right? More right, and right in different ways than we have ever realized. What if Jesus had a message that truly could change the world, but we're prone to miss it? What if we've developed a religion that makes reverent and honoring statements about Jesus, but doesn't teach what Jesus taught in the manner he taught it? What if the religion generally associated with Jesus neither expects nor trains its adherents to actually live the way of Jesus?" I think we're more like Peter. I think we have sanitized the message of Christ. I think we have bronzed it, we've enshrined it, we've locked it behind stained glass windows. But what if we are the ones who by our words and inactions are rebuking Christ? Brothers and sisters, I say it again, there is a pervasive sense that things are not right in the world. It's nauseating, it's sickening. Yet Christianity, for the most part, only offers nothing more than 1 hour of some sort of flimsy little chaplaincy service, and they want to tell us that things are going to get better in the by and by, and that's all they have to offer. If that's it, then it's no good. But what if into the midst of the chaos and uneasiness of this world, into the center of a world drunk on power and mesmerized by materialism, what if into the middle of religious wars and terror, inequities, corporate greed, misinformation, into the middle of corruption, disease, police brutality, and desperate poverty, what if into the middle of our jobs, our schools, our lunchrooms, dorms, campuses, carpools, little league games, into the chaos and ordinariness of our lives, what if into the center of our churches transfiguration happens? What if God is desperately trying to turn our cheeks toward God's and say, listen to me? God is always trying to communicate. He's always been trying to communicate with His creation. From the dawn of creation, God has desired to hold His people in covenant embrace. He's longed to walk with them and talk with them. And He walks with me and talks with me and tells me I'm His own. The Hebrew writer says, long ago God spoke to our ancestors and many in various ways by the prophets. But in these last days He's spoken to us by the Word. John says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Words matter. Words matter. To that man lying in the hospital bed, the words he's been told his whole life is that you're no good. You can never be good enough. Grace can't reach you. My friend, words matter. But into that, the disruptive affirmation of the gospel says, grace reaches you. It's an ocean and I am swimming in it. God has always been trying to speak. The signal is always going out from the tower. But it's us, the receivers, who can't seem to tune in. We can't seem to hear above the noise of our lives what it is God is trying to say to us.
Style. Your phone system. Convenient.
Into this room, in this very moment, an engineer will tell you that there are several hundred sound waves and signals coming into this space. But unless you have the right receiver, and unless you're tuned into the right frequency and have the password, you cannot receive the signal. So how do we listen? There's a beautiful moment in the Bible when the prophet Elijah, he feels the presence of God and hears God's voice. The scriptures tell us that a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart, but God was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but God was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper, and it was the whisper of God. Today, if we'll listen with ears to hear, we can hear the whisper where we least expect it. We can hear it in the cry of a baby refugee. We can hear it in the voice of a homeless rabbi who says, "Follow me." We can hear it in the voice of a crack addict or a homeless person or someone who steps into the clothing closet or displaced children. I think we can hear the voice in the words of a young relief worker who recently was killed as a political prisoner, and she's become a martyr. Those are the words of Kyla Mueller in a letter written from prison in Syria to her parents, delivered just weeks before she was murdered. Deny yourself. Jesus says, if anyone wants to be my followers, you have to deny yourself. You have to take up your cross and follow me. What if the key to abundant life is found in pouring out of our lives in service to others? Yesterday we visited Jack Guy in the rest home. And of course he's frantically worried about what will happen when he goes back home and will once again have to tend to Linda. But what if that is the greatest gift he can give her, is to pour of himself out for her? Earl, you understand. What if that is the greatest gift we can give another human being, is just giving everything we have for them? Deny yourself. What if we really took seriously what it means to love our neighbor, to feed our neighbors ourselves, to clothe our neighbor as ourselves? John Calvin's vision of the Christian life is guided by the fundamental insight that what distorts our lives more than anything else is a blind self-love. This self-love is the reason why we love to hear things that flatter us. We hate to hear things that tell us the truth about who we are. Our self-love also provides the driving engine behind our pride, our ambition, and our arrogance, whereby we seek the meaning of our lives in power, wealth, and honor so that we may despise others we consider to be inferior. Brothers and sisters, if we are to be transformed, transfigured more and more into the image and likeness of God, then we have to deny ourselves and we have to eradicate that blind self-love from our hearts. Take up your cross. It's difficult to know exactly what that meant for them. It's hard to know what it's meant over 2,000 years, and even more difficult for us here in Mulberry today in 2015 to realize what it means to take up your cross. But I know one thing for sure. In the Roman world, when you took up your cross, you only took it up one time because it was certain death. It meant the end of who you were. The Apostle Paul says, I must die daily. I have to take up my cross and die every day so that this self-blind love will not take charge of me. Follow me. Jesus says if we're going to enter the kingdom of heaven, we have to follow Him. You see, Jesus performed a world of inclusiveness by His readiness to eat with people who'd been declared impure and unacceptable. Jesus performed a world of welcome in which disqualified sinners without religious merit or social standing were at home with Him. Jesus performed a world with a long neighborly reach in which strangers came into His purview and were made stakeholders in the new social possibility of the kingdom of God. Jesus performed a world of radical discipleship when He said, follow me. It was a bid to loyalty and risk with a downside of abandoning old loyalties to your parents, to your home, to your tradition, to religious and political authorities. So what do we do with these words? Shane Claiborne writes, what do we do when the foolishness of the cross actually makes more sense than the wisdom of this world? What if a fragile world is more attracted to God's wisdom of interdependence and sacrificial sharing than to the mirage of independence and materialism? What do we do when we are the ones who have gone sane in a world gone crazy? There was a song we sang growing up, and I'm about to close, and I know that's a relief for some of you. It went like this. There's a voice calling me from an old rugged tree, and it whispers, draw closer to me. Leave this world far behind. There are new heights to climb, and in me a new place you'll find. For whatever it takes to draw closer to you, Lord, that's what I'll be willing to do. And whatever it takes for my will to break. That's what I'll be willing to do. Mulberry, my prayer for us is that in the middle of our hectic and chaotic situation, into the middle of the busyness and logistics of our making our way in this world, that the disruptive affirmation of the gospel would be known to us, and that we could feel the hand of God taking us by the cheek and turning us toward God. May we in that moment have eyes to see and ears to hear. May we experience transfiguration as He says, listen to me. Amen.